At dawn on the fifth day, 1,800 motorcycles lined Dorothy's street like a river of black steel and polished chrome. The sound wasn't just noise. It was a physical force that rattled the windows of every perfect house on the block. The neighbors, the ones who had spent months trying to erase Dorothy from the neighborhood, watched from behind their curtains with pale faces and trembling hands. They thought they were witnessing an invasion. They thought their property value nightmare had finally turned into a war zone. They didn't realize they were witnessing a debt being paid in full by men who valued honor over insurance premiums. But to understand why the ground was shaking, you have to go back exactly 5 days earlier. You have to go back to the moment 80-year-old Dorothy Williams stood on her crumbling porch, clutching a piece of paper that felt heavier than a lead weight. Her fingers, gnarled by decades of hard work and stiff with arthritis, traced the official blue seal of Riverside Bank. The paper was an eviction notice. It was cold. It was final. And it gave her exactly 120 hours. 5 days. That's all the bank gave her to pack up 53 years of marriage, 2 raised children, and a lifetime of Sunday dinners. 5 days to find a home for the furniture Thomas had built with his own hands. 5 days before the bank took the only thing she had left in this world. Dorothy looked at her house, and for the first time in half a century, she felt like a stranger in it. To the bank, this was just asset number 4092, a liability on a spreadsheet. To her neighbor, Patricia Henderson, it was an eyesore that needed to be purged. The paint was peeling like sunburnt skin. The porch railing was soft with rot, crumbling under her touch like old, brittle bones. The roof, it leaked in 7 different places. Dorothy knew every drip by heart. She'd spent the last winter sleeping in her kitchen because it was the only room small enough to stay warm with a single, buzzing space heater. Her life had become a game of impossible math. Her monthly pension check was a fixed $372. The mortgage payment, after the bank's predatory adjustments, had climbed to $840. For 18 months, Dorothy had performed a slow-motion vanishing act, skipping meals, selling her mother's silver, and sitting in the dark to save on electricity, just to stay visible. But the bank didn't care about her survival. Mrs. Williams, the voice on the phone had said, a voice that sounded like it had been sharpened on a whetstone. We've been patient. The property is a safety hazard. Your presence there is no longer legally permitted. The foreclosure is final. Across the street, Patricia Henderson stood on her manicured lawn, her arms crossed over her designer sweater. She didn't bother to hide her satisfied smile. Patricia had spent 6 months circulating a petition she called the Neighborhood Safety and Property Value Initiative. She'd told everyone at the local grocery store that Dorothy's house was a magnet for crime and a blight on the community. 37 neighbors had signed it. People Dorothy had known for decades. People she'd babysat for. People she'd shared her garden's harvest with when they were struggling. Now they all looked away when she caught their eyes. They wanted her gone. The bank wanted her gone. The neighborhood wanted her gone. And as Dorothy looked up at the sky, it seemed even the heavens were done with her. The sky that morning was wrong. It wasn't blue and it wasn't gray. It was a bruised copper green, the color of a dying penny. Dorothy had lived through 60 tornado seasons in the heart of Oklahoma. She recognized that thick electric weight in the air that made the hair on your arms stand up. She knew the silence that comes before the scream. The radio in Dorothy's kitchen didn't just play the news. It screamed it. The meteorologist's voice was thin, cracking under the weight of the data on his screen. EF5 confirmed on the ground. This is a life-threatening situation. If you are in the More South corridor, you have 10 minutes. Get underground. Now. Dorothy looked at her basement door. The wood was warped, the hinges screaming in protest as she pulled. She thought about her husband, Thomas. He had built this basement in 1947, shortly after returning from the Pacific. He dug the earth himself, pouring the concrete with a frantic kind of energy, as if he were still trying to build a trench to keep the world out. It'll hold, he'd told her, wiping sweat and Oklahoma red clay from his brow. Even if the world ends, this floor will stay put. She was halfway to the stairs when the sound began. It wasn't the wind yet. It was a mechanical roar, a rhythmic thrumming that vibrated in her chest. She looked out the kitchen window and saw them, 25 motorcycles, headlights cutting through the premature darkness of the storm. They looked like a pack of iron wolves. The riders were clad in heavy black leather, their jackets adorned with silver studs and the unmistakable steel pilgrim's patch. To the rest of the neighborhood, this was a nightmare. Curtains snapped shut. Deadbolts clicked into place. Patricia Henderson scrambled inside her house as if the devil himself had just pulled into her driveway. But Dorothy didn't see monsters. She saw men caught in the open. She saw the way the lead rider looked at the sky, a look of primal recognition. The lead biker, a man named Marcus who stood 6'4" with a beard that reached his chest, killed his engine in Dorothy's driveway. He looked at the frail woman on the porch. His voice was a gravelly bass, barely audible over the rising wind. "Ma'am, the sky is turning. We're caught out. Is there a public shelter nearby. Dorothy didn't think about the neighborhood watch warnings. She didn't think about the skull insignias or the tattoos that climbed up Marcus's neck. She saw human beings. "There's no time for the public shelter," she yelled back, her voice surprisingly strong. "Get inside. The basement. Go." The bikers hesitated. They were used to being feared. They were used to doors being slammed in their faces. But the first siren began its long, mournful wail, a sound that meant the tornado was no longer a threat but a reality. "Move," Marcus roared to his men. "Inside, now." The 25 bikers filed into Dorothy's small kitchen, a parade of leather, oil, and sweat. Their heavy boots thundered on her worn linoleum. Boom, boom, boom. It sounded like a drumbeat of war, but it was the sound of survival. Marcus was the last one in. He stopped at the threshold, looking at Dorothy with eyes that were surprisingly gentle. He took her elbow, his hand nearly twice the size of her arm, and guided her toward the basement. "Watch the third step," Dorothy warned as they descended into the dark. "And the fifth. They're soft." As the last man squeezed into the cramped concrete room, Marcus pulled the heavy wooden door shut and bolted it. The air in the basement was thick with the smell of old dust, canned peaches, and 25 terrified men. They were shoulder to shoulder, their leather jackets creaking as they breathed. Then the world above them died. It started as a whistle, a high-pitched, lonely sound that made the ears pop. Then the whistle became a hum, then a rumble, and finally it became the freight train. But it wasn't just a train. It was the sound of the earth being fed into a wood chipper. Above their heads, Dorothy's 53 years of life were being torn apart atom by atom. They heard the windows shatter, a sound like 1,000 crystal vases hitting the floor at once. Then came the scream of wood. It was a structural sound, the groan of the main support beams twisting under the pressure of 200-mile-per-hour winds. In the corner of the basement, a young biker named Jake, barely 21 years old, started to hyperventilate. His breath came in short, jagged gasps. His hands, covered in tattoos of thorns and wire, were shaking so violently his rings rattled against the concrete wall. Dorothy saw him. Amidst the roar, she moved. She pushed through the wall of leather-clad men, her small frame disappearing between them until she reached the boy. She didn't say a word. She simply took his hand. Her hand was wrinkled and frail. His was massive and calloused. But the moment their skin met, Jake's shaking slowed. "Close your eyes, son," she whispered, her voice cutting through the roar in a way that seemed impossible. "Think of the road. Think of the sun on your back and the wind in your face when it's kind. Just breathe with me." Above them, the house gave a final, agonizing shriek. The basement door rattled in its frame as if a giant were trying to kick it down. Dust began to rain from the ceiling, thick and gray, coating the bikers' black jackets until they looked like ghosts. A heavy thud shook the ground. Something massive, perhaps a car or a piece of a neighbor's roof, had landed directly over their heads. For 4 minutes and 37 seconds, they existed in a vacuum of terror. Then, as quickly as it had arrived, the roar faded into a hiss. Then silence. A silence so absolute it felt heavy. Marcus was the first to move. He stood up, his head brushing the low ceiling. He pushed against the basement door. It didn't move. He signaled to 3 of his brothers. Together, the 4 massive men put their shoulders against the wood. "On 3, Marcus barked. 1, 2, 3. The door burst open, sending a cascade of splinters and debris down the stairs. One by one, the bikers emerged into what was left of the world. Dorothy came last, helped by Marcus and Jake. She stepped into her kitchen, but the kitchen was gone. The roof was a memory. The walls had been sheared off 3 feet above the floor, leaving a jagged perimeter of splintered wood. Her refrigerator was nowhere to be seen. Her dining table was wedged into a tree 200 yards away. She stood in the center of the ruins, her hair white with plaster dust. She didn't cry. She just looked at the spot where her wedding photo had hung. It was gone. Everything was gone. But across the street, the tornado's grace had shown its cruel face. Patricia Henderson's house stood perfectly intact. Not a shingle was missing. Not a blade of grass was out of place. Patricia was already on her porch, her phone held high, recording the devastation. "Look at this," Patricia shouted, her voice carry across the silent street. "I told you, Dorothy. I told the council. Your house was a hazard, and now look. You brought those criminals into our neighborhood, and God himself took your roof for it. You're a disgrace, Dorothy. A disgrace." Marcus's hand clenched into a fist so tight his knuckles turned white. He looked at Dorothy, expecting her to break. Instead, she just reached down into the mud and pulled out a small, dirt-caked object. It was Thomas's purple heart. She wiped the grime away with her thumb and tucked it into her pocket. "It's okay," she whispered to Marcus. "She's just a lonely woman who thinks her walls make her safe." Less than an hour later, before the Red Cross had even arrived, a black SUV pulled onto the debris-strewn street. The logo on the door was gold and elegant. Riverside Bank and Trust. Out stepped Richard Knowles. He was a man who looked like he had been pressed in a book, stiff suit, polished shoes, and a face that had never been touched by the sun. He stepped over a piece of Dorothy's siding as if it were a piece of trash. Mrs. Williams, he said, consulting a tablet. He didn't look at the 25 bikers standing behind her like a wall of shadows. I see the property has sustained significant structural compromise. Significant, Marcus growled. The house is gone, man. Knowles gave Marcus a brief, disgusted glance before returning to Dorothy. As the property is now a total loss and poses a liability to the bank's portfolio, we are accelerating the eviction. The 120-hour window is closed. You have 48 hours to clear the lot of personal effects. A demolition crew will be here Monday at 6 a.m. to level the site. She has nowhere to go, Jake shouted, stepping forward. Knowles shrugged, a tiny, clinical movement of his shoulders. That is a matter for social services. The bank's interest is the land. Good day, Mrs. Williams. As the SUV drove away, the neighborhood seemed to consolidate against her. Neighbors who had known Dorothy for 50 years stood on their porches, watching. No one offered a blanket. No one offered a glass of water. They saw the bikers, they saw the ruins, and they saw a problem that was finally solving itself. Marcus turned to his men. He didn't speak with his voice. He spoke with his eyes. A silent command passed through the steel pilgrims. Ma'am, Marcus said, turning to Dorothy. We have to go. We have to check on our own families, our own chapters. But I want you to listen to me. He took her hand, just as she had taken Jake's in the dark. You saved 25 lives today. You didn't ask for our IDs. You didn't ask if we were good men. You just opened the door. He leaned in closer. The steel pilgrims have a saying. The road gives and the road takes, but the brotherhood holds. You're part of the brotherhood now, Dorothy. Don't you forget that. The bikes roared to life. One by one, they peeled away, leaving Dorothy standing alone in the mud. Patricia Henderson laughed from her porch. See, your friends left you the moment things got real. Enjoy the shelter, Dorothy. It's where you belong. Dorothy spent the next 3 days in a gymnasium. She was client number 47. She slept on a cot that smelled of bleach and old sweat. She ate lukewarm soup from a plastic cup. She spent her days at the lot digging through the mud. She found a single teacup. She found a waterlogged book of poetry Thomas had given her in 1965. But mostly she found nothing. Every time she returned to the lot, the neighbors were there, watching. Patricia had even set up a lawn chair. It was a spectator sport watching the fall of Dorothy Williams. By Sunday night, Dorothy sat on her cot and counted her money. $7.32. She had no home, no husband, no children nearby, and no future. She closed her eyes and prayed for Thomas. I'm tired, Tom, she thought. I'm so tired of fighting the wind. Monday morning, 5:45 a.m. The air was cold and crisp. Two massive yellow bulldozers sat at the edge of Dorothy's property, their engines idling with a low, guttural chug. Richard Knowles was back, standing next to a foreman with a clipboard. Start with the foundation, Knowles said. I want this lot cleared by noon. Patricia Henderson was on her porch, coffee in hand, her phone already recording. The end of an era, she narrated to her live stream. Finally, our neighborhood can heal. Dorothy stood on the sidewalk, clutching her plastic bag of belongings. She looked at the bulldozers. They looked like monsters. She closed her eyes, waiting for the sound of the metal teeth hitting the concrete Thomas had poured. It started as a vibration in her feet, then a low hum in the air. Knowles looked up, frowning. Is that a storm? No, the foreman said, looking down the road. That ain't a storm. From the east, the sun began to peek over the horizon, and in that golden light, a line appeared, a line of chrome that seemed to stretch for miles. The sound grew until it was a physical weight, the roar of 1,800 engines. They didn't just arrive, they colonized the street. They came from every direction, north, south, east, and west. Bikers in leather, bikers in denim, bikers with gray beards, and bikers with fresh tattoos. Hell's Angels, steel pilgrims, outlaws, and independent riders. They didn't stop at the curb. They rode right onto the lawns. They surrounded the bulldozers, 3 deep. Marcus Stone led the pack. He killed his engine 10 feet from Richard Knowles. Behind him, 1,800 men and women did the same. The silence that followed was even louder than the engines. Knowles stepped forward, his voice trembling. You can't be here. This is a private demolition site. I have the police on speed dial. Marcus didn't even look at him. He walked straight to Dorothy. He reached into his vest and pulled out a stack of legal documents. Ma'am, Marcus said, his voice echoing in the silent street. Meet Mr. Henderson. No relation to the lady across the street. He's the Steel Pilgrim's head of legal counsel. A man in a leather vest and a very expensive tie stepped forward. Mr. Knowles, the lawyer said, handing him a packet. As of 4 p.m. Friday, the outstanding mortgage for 114 Maple Street was purchased in full by a private trust. The foreclosure is vacated. Furthermore, we have filed an emergency injunction against this demolition based on the illegal acceleration of the eviction timeline. Knowles's mouth hung open. You bought the mortgage? That's That's 6 figures of bad debt. To you, it's debt, Marcus said, finally looking at Knowles. To us, it's rent for the basement. Now, get your toys off Dorothy's lawn. The bulldozers began to back up. The foreman didn't even wait for Knowles. He knew when he was outgunned. But they weren't done. A fleet of flatbed trucks began to roll in behind the bikes. On the first truck was a pre-built, modular cottage, small, beautiful, and brand new. On the second truck was a crew of carpenters, plumbers, and electricians, all of them wearing biker colors. You saved our lives, Dorothy, Jake said, stepping out from the crowd. He was wearing a new vest, and he looked like a different man. We figured it was time we gave you some walls that won't fall down. For the next 12 hours, the neighborhood witnessed a miracle. It was a biker barn raising. 1,800 people moved with the precision of a military unit. While the construction crew set the foundation and locked the modular home into place, hundreds of others were on their hands and knees in the mud. They weren't just cleaning, they were excavating. They found Dorothy's wedding ring. They found her daughter's first communion dress. They found a box of old letters. Every time a treasure was found, a cheer went up that could be heard 3 blocks away. Patricia Henderson tried to come out of her house once. She started to scream about building permits and zoning laws. Marcus didn't yell. He just walked to the edge of her property line and stood there. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her. Patricia turned around, went inside, and locked her door. She didn't come out again for 3 days. The paint was peeling like sunburnt skin. The porch railing was soft with rot, crumbling under her touch like old, brittle bones. The roof, it leaked in 7 different places. Dorothy knew every drip by heart. She'd spent the last winter sleeping in her kitchen because it was the only room small enough to stay warm with a single, buzzing space heater. Her life had become a game of impossible math. Her monthly pension check was a fixed $372. The mortgage payment, after the bank's predatory adjustments, had climbed to $840. For 18 months, Dorothy had performed a slow-motion vanishing act, skipping meals, selling her mother's silver, and sitting in the dark to save on electricity, just to stay visible. But the bank didn't care about her survival. Mrs. Williams, the voice on the phone had said, a voice that sounded like it had been sharpened on a whetstone. We've been patient. The property is a safety hazard. Your presence there is no longer legally permitted. The foreclosure is final. Across the street, Patricia Henderson stood on her manicured lawn, her arms crossed over her designer sweater. She didn't bother to hide her satisfied smile. Patricia had spent 6 months circulating a petition she called the Neighborhood Safety and Property Value Initiative. She'd told everyone at the local grocery store that Dorothy's house was a magnet for crime and a blight on the community. 37 neighbors had signed it. People Dorothy had known for decades. People she'd babysat for. People she'd shared her garden's harvest with when they were struggling.